So then with that bodhicitta motivation in mind, do the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Nice to see everybody. Actually, I was thinking just in connection with bodhicitta motivation, just to share something preliminary, which is, so some, I don't know if some of you may be watching, but, sometimes Lama Zopa Rinpoche has been posting teachings from Nepal, where he's staying right now. And recently he was talking actually about studying the Prajnaparamita, which we're doing, and he made a few points I thought were interesting. And he was sharing all these various quotes, from different sutras and sources that were saying how, like, it's how it's what's the word, unbelievably humongous, like, purification of negative karma to study the Prajnaparamita, and then unbelievable, like, huge creation of positive karma, merit by studying the Prajnaparamita, or studying. And then he made an interesting point. He said that he had one time, I guess, Lama Zopa Rinpoche said he had been talking with Kirti Senchab Rinpoche, who was one of his gurus, who's passed away, who's a great master of Kala Chakra. He was a lineage master who passed the Kala Chakra commentary eventually down to the Dalai Lama. But I guess Kirti Senchab Rinpoche was saying that, like oftentimes in Tibetan Buddhism, we talk about the preliminary practice, the nundro. And I guess one thing that Kirti Senchab Rinpoche said, which I thought was intriguing, interesting, was he said the best nundro is studying the Prajnaparamita. And then he said the second best is reciting the Prajnaparamita Sutra or repeatedly. And then he said, and then the third best is to do the 9 nundros that are often done, like 100,000 prostrations and 100,000 vajrasattva's. So that was interesting that Lama Zopa Rinpoche was saying that people sometimes don't know that or something. So, and then he specifically said, so people who are studying the basic program should be aware of that studying the Prajnaparamita is like a supreme preliminary practice. It's a way it purifies negative karma, it accumulates merit. It sort of is a very good way of preparing to gain realizations of the Dharma. So it was very good that Lama Zopa Rinpoche was sharing that. It was like encouraging or something for our bodhicitta. And that connects actually to where I wanted to pick up with something from last time, and then also there'll be time today for questions. But that's connected in a way to, last class we were talking about the 12 links of dependent origination. And I was pointing out that one thing, if you think about the 12 links of dependent origination correctly, or, in a meaningful way, then one point that becomes very clear is that through ignorance, right, which is the first link, all the other links come about without our control, right? And so one point in relation to that I was mentioning last time is, looking for one piece of paper that had a list of something, but one point that was related to that is that if you understand that, right, like that once you're under the control of ignorance grasping a true existence, then without any choice, right, even if you don't want to give rise to like craving, hatred, pride, jealousy, these kinds of mental states come about. And then through those, we create karma, negative karma, positive karma, whatever, and we compound our samsaric suffering. So then you start to understand, right? Like that renunciation, oftentimes we talk about this term like renunciation, or I think I would say like sometimes people say a better translation of the Tibetan word is definite emergence. Really, that's like the wish, a deep, heartfelt wish to overcome ignorance, right? Because that's the only way. I mean, the meaning of samsara, right, is being under the control of ignorance, really, right? They sometimes say karma and mental afflictions, but actually, karma and mental afflictions, as the 12 links of dependent origination are pointing out, are all, as long as you're under the control of ignorance, all the rest come about. You can't help it. You create karma. And so one benefit of the 12, of contemplating the 12 links, is that you develop this, like, they help you develop um, this heartfelt wish, right, to realize wisdom. And the more you contemplate that, actually, then the more like that, that's the idea, right? Isn't it? The more that other things become less relevant, and what becomes more and more relevant is realizing, is overcoming ignorance, which is very deep in our minds. And what I guess I want to point out is like, and then according to Buddhism, right, like the prajna paramita, right, the perfection of wisdom, is the method to overcome ignorance, right? In other words, and like, according to the Madhyamaka view, there's no other, right? There's no other way, right? If you want to become liberated from samsara, it's only through wisdom. Right? If you want to liberate others from samsara, it's only through wisdom. And so then you can start to understand why, like, all these teachings say, oh, studying the Prajnaparamita is the best thing, or whatever, like that it's so important. Is that because oftentimes I think that, like, what does it mean, actually, right? Like, in other words, whether you say bodhicitta, right, or you say renunciation, those are like we're talking about, like, what's the motivation of Dharma, right? Really, it's to achieve liberation, right? For yourself and for others, right? First, you have to understand it for yourself, right? In other words, if you don't, they say that in one teaching, if you can't give rise, if you haven't yet given rise to the wish to liberate yourself from samsara, then you won't give rise to the wish to liberate others from samsara, because you don't understand what samsara is then, right? Because samsara is being under the control of ignorance and mental afflictions, right? And so I guess what I'm going with, just trying to point out, is that, so if you think deeply about the 12 links in that sense, then you feel, wow, like studying, practicing, meditating on the prajna paramita, right, the perfection of wisdom, is the most important thing. And actually, you start to see, I just want to point this out. I was thinking about this the other day. I was talking to a friend, and he was actually talking about the life of the great Mahasiddha Maitripa. But there were all these, like, Mahasiddhas, right, who, like the Buddha, himself, who are like king, right? The Buddha was like a prince who left home, right? Or Atisha also was like a prince, right? Maitripa was quite wealthy, left home. And they sort of give up. Then we say, oh, they gave up everything. They left everything behind to pursue the path, right? But actually, it's like, that's in a way a wrong understanding, isn't it? Like, because from their perspective, they understood the 12 links of dependent origination, or they understood the Four Noble Truths, right? From their perspective, actually, like, what they were leaving behind looked like a prison, right? Like, from their perspective, like, what ordinary people wish for, right? Like an ordinary samsaric comfortable life looks terrible, right? And why, actually, right? Like, why does it look terrible? Because from their perspective, it's causing themselves and others suffering. And what they want, actually, it's not like they're giving up happiness. That's an important point, isn't it? Like, whereas if you understand these points, right? Like, so my friend was telling me his life of Maitripa. He was like going everywhere asking about wisdom, actually. He was asking teacher after teacher about Mahamudra, about Madhyamaka, about wisdom, about Chittamatra, about these different views, trying to realize the nature of his own mind, right? Because he felt everything else is meaningless. Everything else is just more suffering, and he had some deep experience of that. So anyway, we have to contemplate points like the 12 links of dependent origination or the Four Noble Truths in order to gain an experiential insight that of how, and actually you also have to look inside yourself to see if it's true, don't you? Like, you have to check and see, like, is it true actually that through my grasping at things in a distorted way, I give rise to mental afflictions? And then because those mental afflictions, like without any choice, I develop all these different actions, right, that are suffering actually in nature, right, and that give rise to suffering. And if you start to see that, right, then you feel, well, I don't want to keep doing that, right? And so what becomes interesting, what becomes exciting, what becomes energizing is is wisdom, actually, right? And so you can see how, like, then from that perspective, like, wow, if you get to hear, study, read, contemplate, meditate on Prajnaparamita, it's like, wow, that's like thing, because that's the method, right, to liberate yourself and others from suffering. And so then our enthusiasm for the Prajnaparamita, for the wisdom itself, right? Prajnaparamita, you can say, is a text, but actually it's really, we went through this. The texts of the Prajnaparamita are not definitive Prajnaparamita; they're the textual, whatever. The actual Prajnaparamita is wisdom itself, right, in the mind of a person, of a being. And so you get more and more, the idea is that through contemplating those kinds of teachings, you get more and more energized, seeking wisdom. Anyway, so that's, and then I wanted to just go back and sort of say a few more things about, I won't say a lot more about the 12 links, but a couple more points quickly. One is, so the 12 links we went over mostly teach, they teach how does samsara arise, right? But then also they imply, or they also can be taught in terms of how samsara ceases, right? And the main point is, if you stop ignorance, then all the others stop. Right? So in other words, if you don't stop ignorance, you can't just say, oh, I don't want to die. You can say it, it won't work. You'll still die. You can say, I don't want to have craving and grasping. It won't matter. You'll still have craving and grasping. You can say, I don't want to have hatred. But if you don't have wisdom, you'll eventually hate somebody. Because that's the nature of ignorance. Does that make sense? Like, as long as you have ignorance, all those other things will eventually come along. And so, but if you gain wisdom that overcomes ignorance, then, then you don't give rise to the mental afflictions, you don't give rise to karmic actions, and then the whole process breaks down of samsara. Right? And instead if it's Prajnaparamita, then you're practicing Mahayana, then then you're on your way to Buddhahood, right? To enlightenment, to full enlightenment of Buddhahood. So anyway, the idea is that you overcome ignorance through wisdom, and that breaks down the cycle of samsara. Now, in the Heart Sutra, it says, right, there is no ignorance and no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death, right? So the no ignorance, and up to no aging and death are the 12 links of the forward order, the 12 links that give rise to samsara. And then where it says no extinction of ignorance, up to no extinction, that's implying the reverse order, right? That if you overcome ignorance, then all the others up through birth, aging, and death will stop. And where it's saying there's no ignorance and no extinction of ignorance, right? What that's getting at is that those 12 links, right? They're in one way, by contemplating them, we want to gain wisdom. And then once they're saying here, from the perspective of the Heart Sutra, once you gain wisdom, you understand that the 12 links themselves lack any inherent existence, right? That they themselves are empty. Just like form is empty and emptiness is form, right? Ignorance is empty and emptiness is ignorance, right? Karma is empty and emptiness is karma. Right? So like does that make sense? So each of the 12 links is also empty of inherent existence, right? And if those 12 links actually, if ignorance existed intrinsically, right, from its own side independently, then it couldn't be overcome. Right? but because ignorance is dependently arisen, right, it exists just conventionally, right? But if you search, right, for an ultimately existent ignorance, there is no, findable ultimately existent ignorance, and therefore ignorance can be overcome. It's part of the point, and all those links can be overcome. Right? It's interesting. I'll just give one more point there. Right? It says no extinct and no aging and death. Right? And actually, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's easy, right, to say aging, right, for ourselves. So from a conventional perspective, right, just using that as the example, because all of these, it's the same, right? From one perspective, conventionally, if you say, wow, I'm older than I was, and aging is, sometimes we'll say, right, if you observe it, then aging is not always easy, is it? Like, because things come along with aging, like, that are sometimes unpleasant. And conventionally, if you just say, well, I'm getting older, and my back hurts, or my digestion isn't as good, or my sleep isn't as good, or my whatever it is, all these different things, right? Then that's true, right, conventionally. But then if you engage in an ultimate analysis, trying to find, what's the word, like an intrinsically existent referent for aging, right? Well, actually, it's quite funny, isn't it? Because, like, if you say, well, I'm going to find aging by looking in the past. First of all, the past exists in mere name, right? There's nothing findable. There's no findable past apart from the word, right? The name, memories, thoughts. They're just conceptions, right? And then, actually, if you search the present for aging, right? Like, actually, in one way, if you could say, well, I look in the mirror, I have some wrinkles, right? But then the same thing we did. Remember one session we did this about, one class we did this about water, right? You could do the same thing about your own. Actually, first of all, if you look in the mirror, right? Actually, it's kind of funny, isn't it? See, I looked in the mirror and I saw it aging. Well, actually, all you see is a reflection, isn't it? There's no face in the mirror. Actually, you can't see your own face. It's kind of funny, isn't it? Right? Like, so actually, if you looked in the mirror and you said, I saw it aging, actually, all you saw was a reflection. Right? So it actually is the mirror aging? Is the mirror your aging? Are the light rays that bounced off your, right? There are like rays of light that bounced and reflect into a retina. Is that aging? Right? There are like, neurotransmitters, like nerve electrical impulses going from the eye. Are those aging? Right? Are the, and actually, the glass is not, like, the glass that reflects somebody's face is not that person's aging, is it? The light rays are not that person's aging, right? The visual image is not that person's aging. Right? And then you could do the same analysis, right? Like, if you looked at the subatomic particles that make up a face, like, is the quark aging? Is the quark, my aging? Is the electron my aging? And so you come to the conclusion, eventually you would realize, like, if you searched everywhere, right, there's nothing findable that's aging. So how does aging exist? As a mere appearance and mere name, right? Not findable from its own side. Right? Empty of any self-existent nature. Right? It's weird, isn't it? You can see how it actually, it's like, sometimes we say that in mere name, right? The lamas say that in mere. But actually, if you analyze it, you see it's actually true, right? Or aging exists if we talk about it. Like, if I say, oh, I'm older than I can tell I'm older than I was 10 years ago, well, verbal, that's true, right? As we can talk about that, we can have a conversation. But if you do, where were we talking about this thing of, that's conventional, right? If you're satisfied, conventional means satisfied with the mere name, right? Satisfied with mere designation. But if you do ultimate, what we call ultimate analysis, right? An ultimate mind. If you start to search, you can't find any truly existent referent. So it means aging is empty of existing from its own side, or by its own nature, or intrinsically. So all the 12 links are like that. They're empty of existing intrinsically from their own side, or inherently. And so I wanted to mention something else. So this, now we're in this paragraph, right, that includes the 12 links. And I want to say, like, stepping back, almost taking a little bit broader view for a second. There are different, like I mentioned when I started the teaching on this paragraph, that the most common in there are different commentaries that say different things. The most common explanation in the commentaries, where it says, so it says, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, and so on. The most common explanation is the one I already mentioned, which is that the reason those are all listed is it refers to the experience that we gain on the path of meditation, where in what they call, well, I've used these terms before, but there's something called the uninterrupted path. So in other words, when a bodhisattva there's the uninterrupted path, and then there's the path of subsequent attainment. So when bodhisattvas are directly realizing emptiness, that's the uninterrupted path. And what this is, from that perspective, what this is getting at is that when you're in that state, an ultimate state, a state of realizing ultimate truth, no conventionalities appear. Does that make sense? So one meaning of that paragraph is that experientially from that perspective, nothing is appearing except emptiness. And your mind is like water poured into water, with no sense of subject and object, in other words, just immersed in emptiness. So one reason all these things are listed, saying, no this, no this, no this, no this, no, all these no things, is that in that state, those things don't appear to that meditative equipoise, we sometimes say, right? So the meditative equipoise of the Arya Bodhisattva realizing emptiness, no conventionalities appear. Another reason, actually, in different commentaries, another point that's made is that sometimes they say also all those things are listed because on the Bodhisattva path, you have to realize the emptiness of all those things. So the Bodhisattva, as they practice, also has to realize that all those different phenomena are empty. And one thing that's useful, right, to think about is that all those things listed there, right, no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no eyes, no ears, and so on, those are conventionally existent phenomena. Like, so the Buddha, Avalokiteshvara here, isn't listing things that don't exist. He's not listing rabbit's horns and what's it called? One sutra gives examples of non-existence, right? The traditional one in Tibetan Buddhism, in Indian Buddhism too, is the horn of a rabbit, right? Because rabbits don't have horns like a sheep, like a ram or something. In the Sutra of Golden Light, they use an example. What do they say? Like a tall ladder made out of the legs of gnats, doesn't exist. It can never exist, right? So here, the Avalokiteshvara is not listing non-existent phenomena, he's listing existent phenomena, right? And he's saying, so he's giving these categories, he's saying all phenomena that exist are empty. So that's another meaning of why all those examples are given, is he's giving different examples of it, or different categories or different ways of listing all existent phenomena, and then saying they're all empty. There's nothing findable. There's nothing that exists from its own side. And we'll get to in a couple minutes, Khedrubje, who's one of Lama Tsongkhapa's two closest disciples, he gives an additional interpretation of why all those are listed, which I'll get to in a minute. But I just want to pause and point out, like, this idea that all phenomena are empty of intrinsic nature. As we were talking about before, that is a unique tenet of the Prasangika Madhyamaka school, right, of philosophy, which is said to be, which all Tibetan Buddhists say is the ultimate intent of the Buddha. I think Zen Buddhists say that too, mostly. But anyway, so the Madhyamaka, is the ultimate meaning of Prajnaparamita, ultimate meaning of emptiness. And so here it's pointing that out, that all phenomena lack intrinsic nature. And that connects, what I wanted to do a little bit of today, actually, is I'm going to turn to Tendar back, we were using Tendar Larampa's commentary to the Heart Sutra. And he raises some interesting points in relation to this paragraph. And so I just thought to sort of look at a few of his points about the text because they're quite, deep. So one point, and for the, you don't need to look in the text if you don't want to, but if it's for those who feel like it, I'm starting at the second to last paragraph of page 15. And Tendar Larampa, well, actually, he says, he's talking about that paragraph, and he says regarding that, or he makes a number of points, but one is he says regarding that, the non-Buddhist Samkhyas assert what is called the self, the conscious Purusha, that's their word for self, which abides among the aggregates. They assert that apart from forms being seen and sounds being heard through the sense powers such as the eye, there is no need for a separate eye consciousness that sees forms. And Khedrubje says in his Clearing Away the Mental Darkness about the 7 works of Dharmakirti that this section of the sutra discussed above is for the purpose of refuting that assertion that a self is found in the consciousness. And I'll read one more sentence. He says, the conception of a self asserted by non-Buddhists is an artificial conception of self. So I just want to kind of pause there. One is, I'll say a few things. One is, this is what I was referring to earlier. So Khedrubje is one of the 2 heart disciples of Lama Tsongkhapa. And here, Tendar Larampa mentions that Khedrubje gives an additional interpretation. He says, another reason why the Buddha listed all these categories is to refute the view of the Samkhyas. So by saying all these things are empty of inherent, empty, let's say, he's refuting a view of the Samkhyas, which is that there's a self in the aggregates. So that's one point, which is, I can leave that briefly, but what I wanted to just start talking about from this paragraph, this little section next, is this, though, is Tendar Larampa is getting at something relevant to our practice here, which is that there are conceptions of self which are artificial. He uses that term, artificial conceptions of self, and then there are innate conceptions of self, and he mentions both. And I wanted to just reflect on that. So artificial conceptions of self, right? Like he's giving the example of a non-Buddhist school, right? And that school says that there's they call it a Purusha in Sanskrit, I guess, but they say there's a self that somehow abides within the aggregates. And their view is that they would say, well, because, when you see your own aggregates, you think I, naturally. So there must be a self there because you think it. Essentially, you apprehend it, and actually, I wanted to pause here. There are all kinds of views of self, is one point. Actually, if you like, and I just want, these are, and that are artificial, right? And artificial means in this context, in the context of Buddhist practice, what they're getting at is that people who make up theories or philosophies or religious doctrines have come up with many, many different, what's the word, conceptions, artificial conceptions of a self. Artificial here means like intellectually constructed. Right? And so, like, for example, some people grow up this way, right? If you're taught growing up, that you have an eternal, unchanging soul. Right? That would be, according to Buddhism, an artificial conception of self. That's not innate. That's, certain religious doctrines teach that, right? Or some, and then there are others, they're all different views, right? Like there are actually like in like literary theory, there are conceptions of a self, and in religion, different religions have different theories of self, of what a self is. And then there are, different psychological schools have different views of what a self is. And so all of those are kind of, say, intellectually acquired. Like if you go to church, you'll learn one. If you go to a certain psychology program, you'll learn another. If you go to a certain university, you'll learn another. And so those are all like intellectually acquired. And one point is like, so there are Buddhist scriptures, Buddhist teachings that refute artificial views of the self, right? Because Buddhism is saying all of those views of kind of eternal selves or self-existent selves are false. So Buddhism refutes those. But then, what Buddhism is saying is that those are superficial in some sense, right? It's interesting though, I just want to pause and reflect on this. Like, they're superficial in the sense that they're acquired intellectually, but if you habituate yourself to something deeply, it becomes not innate, but it becomes very natural to you, doesn't it? Like, this is true of anything, isn't it? Like, in other words, like, yeah, if you habituate to any belief, then like, it's weird, isn't it? Like, how to say this right? Like, you could become totally enraged then if somebody disagreed with your belief, right? You could even, like, people kill people because they disagree with their belief, right? So intellectually acquired beliefs can become very pernicious or something like that, can't they? I was thinking that recently. I was just thinking that the other day. I was like, yeah, hopefully, it's not clear. It's not clear yet, isn't it? Is it whether, like, people have intellectually acquired beliefs right now about politics, and it's not clear that Americans won't kill each other over those. Well, is it yet? Like, in the next few weeks, I'm hoping Americans don't start, in huge numbers killing each other. I mean, people already do, actually. They already are killing each other, actually. It's not few, small numbers. Hopefully it won't be millions of deaths over intellectually acquired beliefs. So intellectually acquired beliefs are powerful, right? But it's weird, isn't it? They're also superficial. And what I mean by that is, like, people can change those. It's so strange, isn't it? Like, people can deeply believe something and then just not believe it after a while, right? And actually, it's like, if you see that, right, like, there are people who, like, I remember like one, I read one biography of a woman, a wonderful book about love. And there's this woman she was like in an extremely conservative church, where she would, like, describe her own experience, where, like, if she saw somebody who was different than her, she couldn't stand them. And if she saw somebody who was gay, she couldn't stand them. If she saw somebody who was had sex before marriage, she couldn't stand them. All these things. And then one day she was getting an advanced degree in religious studies to be more effective in that church. And she suddenly awakened and realized she was gay and she had an affair with another woman. And, suddenly all those beliefs were like, she was like, and we took her a little while, but all those beliefs were gone, like these beliefs that she had and held on to so strongly. So intellectually acquired beliefs can change through external circumstances, is my point. Does that make sense? Like, people believe a certain thing because of a certain culture, because of a certain group. They're part of a group. They're part of a milieu. They're sort of educated a certain way. And then if you get a different education, you can change those beliefs through thinking and through experience. The innate one doesn't change those ways. The innate belief in itself, they say, actually, in Buddhism, that we've habituated to that since beginningless time. So, as long as we've been in samsara, which is beginningless, we've habituated to grasping at a self. And here, I just wanted to share this, because all that is to kind of get at a point, which is, so, there are various Buddhist teachings to refute superficial, intellectually acquired, artificial conceptions of self. But the main point of Buddhist practice is to overcome our own innate grasping at a self. And here, Tendal Rinpoche says something very interesting, I think, something really kind of intriguing. So I'll reread the last sentence I read, and then I'm going to read the next one, which is the very intriguing one. So he says, the conception of a self asserted by non-Buddhists is an artificial conception of self, right? So that could be like, you have an eternal soul that's unchanging, that was made by God, or you have a Purusha that's hidden in your aggregates, right? Oh, what was that? Anyway, all those kinds of beliefs. But now he says something really intriguing. He says, so he's talking now the innate conception of a self. He says, is the conception of a substantially existent person in the sense of self-sufficiency, which is asserted by the Svatantrikas and below. And so there, and then he goes on to explain that, but I want to pause there. That's really interesting, isn't it? So what he's saying is that non-Buddhist schools, when they assert, when non-Buddhist schools assert a self, right? Like some Hindu schools assert an Atman, right? There are all different kinds of conceptions. He says those are artificial. But then he makes an interesting point. He says, he's basically saying, he's talking from a Prasangika perspective here, Prasangika Majjhimaka perspective. And he says, other Buddhist schools assert a self, right, that exists, that is substantially and self-sufficiently, in some sense, existent, or there's at least that there's a self-sufficient basis for the self. And he says that assertion of those Buddhist schools is actually the innate, correlates to the innate conception of a self. Of course, those other schools wouldn't agree with that, would they? Like a Svatantrika, he's saying Svatantrika Majjhimaka. So he's saying the self asserted by Svatantrika Majjhimikas is the innate form of ignorance, right? They would say, no, of course it's not. We're teaching, the definitive meaning of the Buddha. Same thing, right? He's saying the sense of self that's taught by mind-only school and so on. He's saying that's the innate ignorance. Of course, a mind-only philosopher would say, no, it's not. That's you're being nihilistic or something. So that's interesting, right? And what he's trying to help us do is get at how subtle that innate. This is why I think this is important for practice. Is he's helping us as practitioners get at the subtle, innate grasping at a self. How subtle that is. That even other Buddhist schools hold on to it. So let's continue on with this paragraph, because I think this is very useful for practice. So he says, in that mode of conception, the self that serves as the basis of the conception thinking I does not depend on or rely on the aggregates, but appears as a controller or a master of the aggregates. And the aggregates appear as the controlled or the servant of the self. This is demonstrated by the fact that when an individual conceives, what an individual conceives of as my form and my feelings appear to be things an individual would certainly be willing to exchange for those of others if that were possible. And so here he's getting at this innate sense of self is not something intellectually acquired, right? But actually, if you think about it, like what he's getting at is when he says you would trade it, think for a moment about we're not talking about something intellectual here, but think about the natural experience like of an adult or even a child when they feel jealous, right? Like, so let's say you look at somebody else and you think, if you're whatever, and you think, oh, they're quite attractive. I wish I looked like them. I want to look like them. Right? Actually, how old are we when we start doing that? Right? Really young, isn't it? And I don't know when we stop. I guess, actually, I don't think we do we? Like, my mom is in her late 70s and she was just telling me an example of, she and her friends experiencing jealousy with each other. Right. And what is jealousy? Right. I mean, in one way, jealousy is like, I'm just giving that as the example. It's a totally natural experience of humans. Right. But he's getting at this point, right? Like, I would trade. I want that. I want to look like them. Right. Or you see somebody you're a kid in school and you see somebody who gets the work quicker than you. Right. You say, oh, I wish I was smart like that. I want to be smart like them. Like, so there's some underlying that, what he's getting at is underlying that feeling of jealousy, right, is an innate sense of I that seems to be separate from and the owner of the aggregates and would like to trade one of them in, right? I'd like to trade my intelligence in for that person's intelligence. I'd like to trade my belly in for that person's abs. I'd like to trade my whatever in for that person's, good looks or something, whatever it is, right? It's like, who's that self? right? He's saying, so you have to ask, who's the self that wants to trade that in? And we don't say, we say the words trade that in, but that's what's implied in the feeling of jealousy, isn't it? Or of envy, right? I want that. I wish I could do what they could do, right? I wish I had what they have. And oftentimes what they have it's their aggregates themselves, right? So there's you see what he's getting? He's getting at something very instinctual to human beings, which is, but instinctual in the negative sense, right? Ignorance. That we have this feeling, this innate tendency to experience ourselves, how does he say it here? As though we're the owner or the master or the controller of our aggregates, right? And as if there's some self then that's sort of separate from the aggregates. Right? Like if you want to, if I would trade it, actually it's kind of funny, isn't it? If I would trade my mind for one person's mind and my body for somebody else's body, what's left? What's left that's me? Actually, it becomes a bit funny, doesn't it? There's no, what's left that's even a basis, right? And that so what he's saying here is that one is the innate, right? He's saying that's one way to identify in our own experience that innate sense of I. That does not rely on the aggregates, but appears as a controller or master of the aggregates, right? And also, like, actually, just think about it. Like, actually, it's kind of funny, isn't it? Like, sometimes you ever have that experience, like in the morning, right, where if you're feeling, if your body and mind feel sluggish, or something, it might be at night, right? Late at night or early in the morning, either one. Could be any time, I guess, particularly those stuff. And then you have the feeling, right? Oh, it shouldn't be this way. I should be alert, or I should be energized or something, right? Like, well, if the mind is not energized and the body's not energized, who's the I that's energized? Like, there's some idea that there's an I that should be able to control, right, the body and mind, and then somehow separate from them, then, is the implication, right? And they say control it like the way you can control your car, that you're separate from your car. You can speed it up or you can slow it down, right? And then you could separate, but actually, like, how do you separate an I from your mind and your body? Right? So he's getting at that's part of the innate sense. And if you check your own experience, there are all these examples, subtle ones like that, right? Oh, why aren't I more this way? Why can't I be like that? As if there's an I that's separate from who you are, right? That can be something else. Now, immediately, not through causes and conditions that you'll create some other, anyway, you get my point. And one other point I want to get at, though, is I want to go back now to the earlier part of that paragraph where he says, the innate is the conception of a substantially existent person in the sense of self-sufficiency asserted by Svatantrikism below. So what he's getting at there also is all other Buddhist schools, apart from the Prasangika Madhyamaka, in one sense, they actually have, there's one sense in which they can say, in general, their view is that there is a self that's conceptually labeled, right? Like, so they agree with that. They agree with the Prasangikas on that point. But from their perspective, they say, but there has to be something that's an illustration of the self that really exists, right? That's that onto which we label the self. So some schools would say it's the consciousness, for example, right? Like, so they would say, well, yeah, of course, like for example, in my case, they might agree. They might say, well, there are the 5 aggregates, and then you label Lauren on those, right? I label Lauren on those, right? But then they would say, but Lauren is not completely non-existent like a rabbit's horn, right? Lauren does exist. So there has to be a substantially existent referent for that. And so I'll get, I mean, there are different Buddhist schools give different examples or illustrations, but the most common one is the mental consciousness. Right? So they would say, well, the mental consciousness exists from its own side, and that's the illustration of Lord. And that is truly existent, or that is substantially, that exists from its own side, at least, depending on which Buddhist school. But you could at least say all Buddhist schools would say that exists from its own side. And one thing that the Protestant Gikas are getting at is, Nagarjuna says, he makes this point, he says, once you grasp at something existing from its own side, which doesn't exist from its own side, then you're asserting a self again. And part of what he's getting at is that consciousness itself doesn't exist from its own side. Any more than, what was the example we gave earlier? Your face in the mirror, right? In other words, if you search an instant, and part of that is like, because the example they use for consciousness is momentary, right? Whereas there's no permanent consciousness. But then if you start to search a moment of consciousness, looking for an intrinsically existing consciousness, right? Actually, first of all, as soon as you start to search that moment's gone, isn't it? And then that means that moment is past, right? And as I said earlier, in what sense does past exist? In mere name, right? If you search a future consciousness, like you say, so if you're searching for a truly existing consciousness, right? So you say, well, how about this moment of consciousness? Well, as soon as I said it, this moment's past. So that moment I just referred to only exists as a name, right? It does exist. How does it exist? As a name. Oh, I was thinking this yesterday, or 5 minutes ago, I thought that, right? I can say that, but is there anything substantially existent that is that past consciousness? No, definitely not, right? That's easy. And then is there a substantially existent future consciousness? Of course not, right? It doesn't exist yet. And then if you try to find the present, right? Actually, the present moment is made up of parts of that moment, right? And so, and so are you anyway, so you get the point, right? So where is the substantially existent consciousness? If you take 1 minute, right? Where is the substantially existing consciousness in that minute? Does it exist on one of those 60 seconds or in a quarter of a second, somewhere in that 60 seconds? And you come to the conclusion, there is no substantially existing consciousness. So what he's getting at here is that a few things. So anyway, so you get my point there. So one is, what's interesting though, I just want to go back to, is the core thing that he's saying here is that sense that there's something there that's a consciousness that's substantially existent, which then asserts itself as a controller or master of the aggregates. That's the innate sense of self. And I think Tendar Larampa there is giving us a wonderful gift, which is that, so then when we have that experience of feeling like there's a self that exists in that way, we found the object of negation. That's the object to be refuted, that we then use as a basis for meditation. So I think that's very, I just want to share. So one is I want to emphasize that paragraph because I think that's very useful. It's a unique kind of way that Tendar Larampa puts that in this commentary. And I think it's useful for our practice because it helps us to get at the experience of the object of negation. I'll just continue on. Yeah, you have time. I just wanted to continue on with his, he goes on to explain more about these topics. So he says, the first couple of paragraphs, I'm just going to mention very briefly because I don't think that's going to be as relevant to y'all. But he says, one point he says, actually, I'll just read the first sentence. He makes a point then. He says, now he's talking about debating with the non-Buddhists about, first he's going to address how do you debate with the non-Buddhist about their assertion of these artificial conceptions of self. Right? And so he gives an example. He says, a Buddhist could say the subject, the mind thinking I, the reasoning employed by non-Buddhists to prove the existence of a substantially existent self of persons is, so the non-Buddhist would say, the subject, the mind thinking I, operates correctly because it operates naturally upon seeing the aggregates without the mind being previously directed, as is the case, for example, with the apprehension of blue. So, what he's getting at there is that the Samkhya's would say, well, when the person, and this is true actually, I mean, it is true that when people see their aggregates, they think I. And so the Samkhya's would say, well, you think it when you see the aggregate, so there must be an I there, right? That proves there's an I. And then he goes down, he says, the reasoning the Buddhists use to refute the existence of a substantially existent person to those Samkhya's would be, the subject, a self-sufficient person that is not imputed to either the collection or the continuum of the aggregates, does not inherently exist because of not either being the same as or different from the aggregates, as is the case, for example, with the horns of a rabbit. So there he's using that example, the horns of a rabbit that I used earlier. And what he's saying, it's actually the reason we've done this many times, this reasoning, right? It's not one with the aggregates and it's not different from the aggregates. So, and therefore it's not substantially existent, is the response a Buddhist might give to a Samkhya. And then he gets into a qualm, which is just, what he says is, actually it's addressing, the qualm is really addressing what we call, prasangika. I've mentioned this a couple of times before, I think, but this term prasangika majamaka, Sanskrit for prasangika, the word prasangika is translated consequentialist, which means that such philosophers use absurd consequences to prove their point. So they take what somebody else asserts, and if that assertion leads to an absurd consequence, then it can't be correct. Does that make sense? And so what he's getting at here is that some people would say, well, at the very beginning of his argument, it said, the subject, a self-sufficient person, and then he goes on to, he's saying, well, that subject doesn't exist, so how can you use that as the basis for an argument? And what he's basically getting at is, I'm using consequentialist reasoning. In other words, you're asserting that, so I'm going back to your assertion and proving there's an absurd consequence, which is that, and therefore it doesn't exist. So, so basically it's like, just to put it simply, we don't need to dwell on this point, but, if you were to assert something that's completely fictional, as if it were true, right? I might, there's the kind of consequentialist reasoning would be to say, oh, well, you say such and such. But if you follow that to its logical conclusion, what it means, there's an absurd consequence, so therefore it's not true. So you take the other person's assertion, which you don't agree with, and you point out the absurd consequences of it. So he's just saying they're using that kind of reasoning, essentially. And therefore it's okay to have the subject of the argument be something that's non-existent because it's non-existent, but the other person doesn't, and you're helping them realize that. But anyway, that I didn't really want to dwell on because that's more of a point for debate, point about logic, Buddhist logic and reasoning, which is not our main topic today. But then I wanted to get to this next paragraph because I think this is the other one that I really wanted to share because I thought there were some useful things in it for people's practice. So here it's near the bottom, second to the bottom on page 16. Tendar Rinpoche says, furthermore, not only do non-Buddhists just assert substantial existence in the sense of self-sufficiency, it is clear that Sautantrikas and Chittamatras assert that gross form and consciousness are substantially existent in the sense of self-sufficiency, because those proponents of true existence assert that if something is imputedly existent, it is imputed to a basis of designation that is substantially existent in the sense of self-sufficiency. And then he says, how can one know this? It is proven by what is said by Tsongkhapa in his Illumination of Thought, which is Tsongkhapa's commentary to the Chandrakirti's Majjhimaka Avatara. And here's the quote from Lama Tsongkhapa. The others, meaning non-Prasangika Buddhist schools, assert that things that are imputedly existent are imputed in dependence upon a basis of designation that is substantially existent in the sense of self-sufficiency. So you see what he's getting at there. This is kind of what I was saying earlier, but I just want to, he's raising an interesting point, which if we study tenets at some point, we'll get into a lot more detail on this. But here I think it's relevant in terms of the Heart Sutra and our practice of about emptiness. And actually, I just want to get at it like so what he's getting at is, so this idea of imputedly existent, right? So what does it mean for something to be imputedly existent? And actually, I just want to try it as an example. I'm not going to use the self for a second. I'm going to use like, I'm going to use an example like, I'm just trying to explore what he's getting at there and to help us like sort of get at it experientially, and then we can apply it to the self. But if I say, the United States of America is imputedly existent. Well, that's not hard to understand, is it? Like, in other words, there were, started with 13 states, right? And then the number of states increased, right? So, like, if it were, on the one hand, you can't say, and it started with like a group of people who imputed, right? They made up the phrase, right? United States. Like, we know that, right? It's not, in other words, that wasn't, in the 1200s, there was no United States of America, right? So, like, that's not intellectually difficult to understand, is it? Or is that a nation is imputedly existent, or is it exists through, what's the word? Like, we can even say, right, there were founding documents, right? In school, you learn that, don't you? Like when you were a kid, they said, well, there are founding documents, and you studied them if you grew up in the United States, right? Where they said, well, there's the Constitution, you learned, maybe you had to memorize parts of the Declaration of Independence, right? And you, I don't know, did people even, I don't know if we learned, depends, I guess, where we grew up, but like, there are the amendments, the Constitution, and so on. I don't think we learned them very well, really, but you learned something about that growing up, right? And so, I don't think we learn all those things that deeply, even, but anyway, but in some very simplistic way, we learned, well, there were a group of people and they gathered and they had a, constitutional convention and all that, right? And so we know on some level, well, they made up the name. So, Betsy Ross, Soda Flag, whatever, so like this myth, story, like, that nations have, right? So if I said, is that imputedly existent? Like anybody who thought deeply about it and was fairly intelligent and fairly well educated could say yes, right? So does that mean it doesn't exist? No, right? Everybody would, if you live in the United States, you say, no, of course the United States exists. And if you said, does it really exist? Everybody would say yes, right? And it's weird, isn't it? So you start to ask, so how does I'm just picking the United States because it's something more distant than itself, right? How does it exist? And do you see how there's a part of you, if you check your own experience, there's a part of you that feels there's something there, right? Sea to shining, actually, there's that song, From Sea to Shining Sea. It's there. It's the United States, right? And actually, it's funny, isn't it? Like, what's the referent in your mind? It might be the people. It might be the mountains and the valleys. Could be the whatever, like there are different images, right? It could be the Capitol building or something. But you feel there's something there from its own side that is the United States. And that's what in other words, what he's saying here is that everyone other than a prasangika can recognize there are certain things that are imputedly existent. right? And that's what, actually, I'll use his exact phrasing here. Further, not able to, but they feel that that things are imputed on the base onto a basis of designation that is substantially existent in the sense of self-sufficiency. Right? So the feeling that we have about anything, actually, is, if we think it's imputedly existent, is that there's something there from the side of the object that is that thing, though, also from its own side. Right? That self-sufficiency in this sense means, that it's that not depending on something else. Right? That's what self-sufficient means. That something is what it is, not dependent upon some other factor. And I'm just using the United States as the example, but think about it for a moment, right? And if we're honest with ourselves, we all have, even if we say, yes, it's imputedly existent, it's not like it was the United States before the founding of the nation or something. But the feeling you have, or we have, is that there's something substantially existent or self-sufficiently existent that is the referent for that. It's not just a word, right? We don't say it exists, it's just a word. So this is, and there we're getting closer. So what he's saying is that everyone other than a prasangika, essentially, believes and feels and experiences that, believes, let's say it that way, that imputedly existent things, in order to not, or how do you differentiate, I'll be silly for a second. If Linda were to say, if Linda Dane, I'm picking you as example, Linda, if it's okay, I know you're not shy. If Linda were to say, well, no, we're renaming it, it's now the United States of Linda. You'd like that, right? No, I'm joking. Linda's a very humble person, so she's not arrogant, so I can safely use her as an example. But if she said, we're renaming it, it's the United States of Linda, and it includes Canada as well, and Mexico. Why is that not valid? She asserted it verbally. If she didn't actually assert, but if she were to assert that verbally, right? If she were to designate that, what's the difference? Like, that's imputed then, right? She said the words, right? So what's the difference between that and saying the United States of America exists? Like, both are imputed, literally, right? I just imputed it, right? And so if I assert right now, the United States and Canada and Mexico are the United States of Linda Dane. But why, what's the difference between that and saying the United States of America exist? It's delusional. What we're getting at in a way is I guess what I'm getting is this, is other Buddhist schools assert that in the end, there has to be some findable basis for a designation, some findable basis, some self-sufficient basis for a designation. And actually, I like Cynthia's answer about it's delusional, because what the prasangikas say is, well, there's somebody else's, they would say, it's a mere convention. There is no ultimate self-sufficient findable basis. So the only way to differentiate those things is through somebody else, either the person's own or somebody else's valid cognition. So they would say there is no ultimate findable basis, right, to prove that. The only proof is you know, all the citizens of Canada would refuse to follow, you know, if Linda made a proclamation, then the citizens of Canada could easily refuse to follow it, because they have a valid cognition that she's not their leader, right? Like there is, it's convention is my point. It's a valid conventional cognition is the difference, right? And so, you know, United States of America or something, right? In what sense does it exist as a country, right? You say it's in mere name, right? And it's because, like, the citizens, the people of the world or whatever, what's the word, function according to that, those documents, right? To some extent, not perfectly. But it's weird, isn't it? That, so what the Prasangikas are asserting and what he's getting at here is there's no, you know, other school, and even like, now we'll get to something simpler, right? Like something more basic, like, so your sense of self, yeah, it's an experience. And again, like it has to be like, you know, it's just getting at something very interesting. So I'm just suggesting this, maybe I'll say it this way. What I want to suggest is actually try, like, my suggestion is to contemplate this in your own experience now. Like, so when you say, when you wake up in the morning or when you have lunch or when you, whatever, after this class, whatever you're going to do next, it's contemplating, like, in what sense does that I exist? Who's going to have lunch? And first of all, does it exist? Actually, it's complicated, isn't it? One is, does the I exist as something self-sufficient? But then the other is that, and actually, I want to point this out, is there's a grosser question, which is, does the I exist as something self-sufficient? I think all of you are easily will see, no, that, like, there's not an I. If you intellectually, at least you can understand that, right? What's a harder question is there something self-sufficient that's the basis of that I? That's a harder question. Is there something self-sufficiently existent that's the basis of that I? Right? That doesn't depend upon something else. Does that make, at least does the question make sense, right? So that's the question I'm just raising to sort of contemplate a little bit is there something self-sufficient that's a basis for the I? Or is there nothing self-sufficient? And the idea here is, like, you know, if you get into that, is that if you contemplate dependent origin, this is where dependent origination comes in then, doesn't it? Is other Buddhist schools actually say for dependent origination to function, things have to be self-sufficient. Something has to be self-existent. Whereas Prasangika Madhyamikas say dependent origination implies nothing is self-sufficient. Everything is mutually dependent. So anyway, these are questions to contemplate. But now what we do is we contemplate them, you know, I was using the example of the country because it's external, but, you know, but that if you apply it to yourself, right? In what sense does yourself exist? Right? And that's what he's getting at in these points. So anyway, maybe that's all. I just wanted to cover those points from Tendar Larampa because I thought they might be useful for practice to sort of contemplate the meaning of those. Then Cynthia, you have a question. Go ahead. You can just unmute yourself, I think, right?
Yeah. So I have a question on the convention. Like when you use the term conventionality, can I apply that to the self? Because when you were describing, so you were defining like artificial self and innate belief, innate self. So what's the difference when you're using conventional, which seems to be synonymous with valid? Is that a valid convention, valid cognition? Is that the same thing? So convention seems to be more external. I don't know, but I'm thinking, is there a conventional self that I could think of as valid,
Yeah.
but yet not inherently existing? Is that a correct way to think about it?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So one way of saying it is that like like so all the artificial, like the intellectually acquired, what was the term we were using? Artificial self, conceptions of self. From a Madhyamaka perspective, those don't even exist conventionally.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So like, in other words, if I say an eternal soul, right, or if I say a Purusha or something, what we would say is that those don't exist ultimately, but they also don't exist conventionally because they're just sort of because they can be disproven through logic. That's the way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
But then there is a conventional I, that exists actually, conventionally. And so you're right, yeah, and that can be, and from a so from the Madhyamaka perspective, you would say that does exist conventionally. So yeah, you're right. Like, and one point is like, and if we differentiate it, the issue is there a self-sufficient I conventionally? No, like that doesn't exist conventionally. But we sometimes say the mere I, right? So if I like, and so if we were to say, Cynthia walked upstairs, right? Like without, and what the point they make is you're not analyzing, does Cynthia exist as one with the aggregates or different than there's no question like that. It's not an ultimate question, but just on a conventional level, like, if you went upstairs in your house and then went downstairs and somebody said, oh, she went upstairs and then she went downstairs, that word she, or Cynthia went upstairs and then went downstairs would be a valid conventional cognition, because if you did go upstairs and then somebody said you went upstairs, that would be a valid cognition. So yeah, and we would say conventionally that self exists. And they actually make a point, just Cynthia, even following up on your point there, that's the kind of stuff that even a Buddha refers, right? When the Buddha in the Sutra says, in a past life, I was a disciple of such and such Buddha, and I, received a prediction of my future enlightenment, and I, worked for the benefit of sentient beings for this many eons and so on. They're talking, the referent is exactly what you're referring to, which is even the Buddha is referring to his conventionally existent, merely labeled self that, from a merely labeled perspective was a disciple of that other Buddha, and then was a merely labeled bodhisattva, and then eventually became a merely labeled Buddha. So that conventional self conventionally exists, whether it's, whether we say Cynthia's or we say the Buddha's conventional self exists. So that there is a conventional self that exists. Does that answer that? Yes. Yeah, other questions? Annie?
Thanks. Sort of piggybacking off of Cynthia's question, since there is like a fluidity to this conventional self, I often joke that identity is not fixed, right? I've seen so many transformations in my own and other people's lives. But I guess the question I have is how, I guess it's maybe an irrelevant question to what we're talking about, but you gave the example of the woman who like had a lot of bigotry and like had like a lot of religious, like anti, everything stances. And then the way you put it is she had an awakening, she fell in love with another woman. So my question is, if there's this constant fluidity, when or how do we get any kind of faith that our efforts or where we are, or what we believe now is what is true? Because it seems like it's always subject to being revoked at any time. Does that make sense?
Say a little more. You said that what we believe now.
So right now I believe that I'm a mother, and I believe that I'm a lawyer. I believe that wearing masks will help me prevent COVID. But like, for instance, the mask one is an easy one. In the beginning of this, everyone's like, oh no, masks aren't going to help at all. I guess the question is, like, from the I sense, or the conventional I sense, or even, the innate I sense, where do you, I guess maybe you never get any solid footing of, like, okay, so maybe now that woman's in love with a woman, but maybe, that could also, that, she could go back to her old religion. Like, I guess it's just, if all of that is empty, where is safety? Where is comfort? Maybe there is none.
Yeah. I think what you're raising is really interesting. Like, actually, I was just, there's one, I mean, there are very, I mean, this is the Heart Sutra is, of course, it's a short Prajnaparamita, but there are longer versions. And the other day I was looking at one commentary to the longer ones, and it was saying this point, that it was saying, they use this language that I thought was interesting. I think it's similar to what you're getting at, which it said, it was getting at the experience of bodhisattvas, and it was saying, it was talking about the same thing we're talking about, which is emptiness, but it was saying the bodhisattva takes his or her stand by not taking a stand in anything. And it said the bodhisattva does not take a stand in form, does not take a stand in feelings, does not take a stand in, and in that way, the bodhisattva takes a stand, which is similar to your language, even about taking a, like you said, where do I take a stand? And what it was getting at is like that the bodhisattva, like, and what does it mean taking a stand? It means not grasping that, and actually I'm going to share one other story like that. Oh, wow. Do I still have, oh no, I put the book away, but there's a story, it's very funny actually. I'll just share it because I think it gets at what you're getting at. There's this story, it's similar to actually another one I used about Tara one time, but I was laughing the other day. I was teaching a class on Tara for another center, and I got out the Vilamakirti Sutra, which is a beautiful sutra that Bob Thurman translated. Somebody else translated it too, but I have Thurman's translation. And there's this point in the sutra where, and I think it's really getting at what you're getting at in a way. There's this point where these Vilamakirti is a wild bodhisattva, and the Buddha tells the other bodhisattvas, go visit Vilamakirti. And even the bodhisattvas and the arhats say, do we have to? Like, I don't really want to go see Vilamakirti, because he challenges their sense of self in ways, like he challenges their sense of identity in a way. And anyways, the Buddha insists, so they go. And there's this moment where Shariputra meets a goddess who lives with Vilamakirti. And the goddess is this sort of like Vilamakirti. And she's this bodhisattva goddess. And there's this funny moment when Shariputra says to her, well, you're this bodhisattva, this amazing being. Why don't you use your merit and your miraculous powers to transform into a man? And the goddess says, I've been in this house for 12 years and I can't find any evidence of male or female. I've been searching for 12 years in this house and I've not yet found one speck of evidence that there's a truly existent male or a truly existent female. And Shariputra doesn't get it. So she snaps her fingers and suddenly Shariputra's takes her form and she takes Shariputra's form. And he looks at himself and then suddenly he's this in the form of a goddess. And she says, hey, Shariputra, why don't you transform yourself back? And he says, well, I'm not really this, so how could I be that? Or something, something of that sort. And she sort of laughs, I guess. But the point being, like, he had a very clear identification with himself as a monk and as a male. And the goddess sort of, plays with that. And it seems like part of the idea that's fascinating in a way is, in one sense, the bodhisattva doesn't take their stand anywhere, or in another sense, I would say, like, they take their stand in emptiness, which is not someplace. But another way of saying it is, which I think is really interesting, is that now the sutra doesn't say this, but in a way, that story about her does, which is, if a bodhisattva were to take their stand anywhere, it would be in compassion, isn't it? Like, in other words, she's actually being compassionate, right? Not, and I think not in the sense that we usually use the word compassion. Usually we use it in the sense of be nice. She wasn't being nice, but she was being extremely compassionate, right? She was teaching emptiness. And I guess my point is like, it's really interesting, isn't it? Like, because like all our role, you're getting at roles again, right? Roles change. But so it's like, one is if we the only place to take a stand is that recognition. One place is the recognition of impermanence. Another is a deeper one is the recognition of emptiness. But there is another, right? Which is that when we're not in the state of what I call the uninterrupted path, realizing emptiness, then to continuously cultivate love, to continuously live in compassion. And actually, because what the Buddha's teachings are saying is if you live in compassion and love and wisdom, there's still nothing to be grasped at. There's still nothing permanent. There's still no safe haven in one sense. But actually, there's a saying that because they live that way, right? Bodhisattvas continually, if they're in the uninterrupted path, then they're in ultimate truth of emptiness. And when they're in the subsequent attainment, in between their meditations, they're continuously cultivating love and compassion. Then the saying goes, therefore, bodhisattvas go from joy to joy. That we're like whatever manifests for them, it's joy. And so I think that seems to be the answer, I think, to the Mahayana answer to that question is because you can't rely. Actually, it is disturbing though, isn't it? Like you can't rely on. I was thinking that yesterday. Like you can't rely on that there will be a United States in 2 weeks, necessarily, but you can rely on love, and you can rely on emptiness because it's reality. Right? Whatever there is in 2 weeks, I'm just picking that as an example. It'll be empty. And whatever there is in 2 weeks, love still has value. It's like I was just sort of reflecting on that myself yesterday, actually. So that's where that's the only refuge. Actually, like if another way of saying it is what's the refuge? It's those things. Yeah, isn't it weird though? But everything else, every other role all our roles, there is no role that's reliable, is there? We so want to hold on to which is funny. That was actually making me think of Rato Rinpoche. He's one of Lama Zopa Rinpoche's teachers. He's still alive. He's in his 90s. He lives in New York. And he was like one of the highest lamas in Tibet. When the Chinese came, he was like the two most senior disciples of the Dalai Lama's senior tutor, Ling Rinpoche, were the Dalai Lama and Rato Rinpoche. So Rato Rinpoche was like one of the most respected lamas, very great scholar and very high tulku. And then the Chinese came and he escaped and he ended up in New York. And I read his biography, I have it, but there was a point when he was like working as a cleaning person at, I think it was Macy's or something, one of the cleaning people. And I was just imagining that, if you saw him, if I had seen him at the time, I would have thought, oh, I wouldn't, if you didn't talk to him, he would just look like, if he was a layperson at that point, and he would have looked like, you might have thought, oh, he's some poor immigrant, which he was, actually, would be a correct label, I guess, in a way. But, he had gone from sort of being in the role of this, where they would sort of put thrones and put, to now from his side, I don't think he cared, actually, he would, because he had he took a stand in emptiness and in compassion. So from his perspective, I don't think it was a problem. But the external role is like, wow, you can't, you know. And if you don't have that internal refuge, then it's scary. Mm. Any other questions before I'll make some other comments? Lynn, or comments, yeah.
When I was thinking, it's easy to see when you talk about the United States, a nation state, because the boundaries change over history. So it's easier as a metaphor. And I remember I was in Mexico City at the university, and there's this beautiful mural. And the mural doesn't have any countries, it has the Americas. And so it was, the Mexicans don't look at us as a different country. They look at us as part of the Americas, North America, what we would say is North America.
Mhm.
And it's only a war that created these boundaries. And a war can change it, and probably will, in hundreds of years. So the whole view of what a country is shattered if you think of how things can change.
It's really true, isn't it?
Yeah. And then the other thing I was thinking is there was a film called The Last Black Man in San Francisco. It's about homelessness in San Francisco. It's a great movie. It didn't get a lot of distribution, but it's creative, so it's not a documentary. But there's a man in the movie who is homeless because of all the housing distress there. And when I went to see the movie, I met a woman in the theater who was his cousin, and he used to be an opera singer, and a very famous opera singer, apparently, very well-known, very recognized, and now he's homeless in the streets of San Francisco. So who is he? What is his identity? It's just really interesting. It's like the example of the Lama that's, was a cleaner in an office building. There really is no identity to that human being. No discernible identity, because he had many different roles.
Mm. Well, one thing, it's just amazing. One is you're often good at giving these really interesting examples. And the other is like, sometimes it's actually even more scary to be it's supposed to be reassuring, but I'm not for a moment. But is like, if you think that's even within one lifetime, and then if you imagine if things can change this much that we're all using examples of in one life, right? Then how much can they change over death and rebirth? And you start to get a sense of like, it's really out of control. It's like, wow, it's like really, what will the planet look like? What will the person look like? What will the realm be? All these things, right? And even we like to assume we'll be human, but of course that's not the assumption of Buddhism, that we stay human all the time. We don't, according to Buddhists. And what's weird though is like, I'll make this one other point, like, they say that Buddha nature, right? The teaching on Buddha nature says Buddha nature, the ultimate meaning of Buddha nature is the emptiness of our own mind. Because the mind is empty, it's Buddha nature. But if you think deeply about what that means, I've often thought this, like, I love those teachings on Buddha nature from the different texts, and things. But if you meditate deeply on what is Buddha nature, it's the emptiness of your own mind, it means you can become a Buddha, but that same trait means you can become a demon. Right? It means you can become a dictator. It means you can become a hell being. It means you can become, if the mind is empty, you can, if you do the right causes and conditions, it'll manifest Buddhahood and never go back. But that also means if you apply other causes and conditions, you'll be Stalin. You'll take rebirth someday as Mao or as Hitler or as Stalin or something. but the point is like, because things change, and because there's just what you're saying, right? It's like we can become anything, and if it depends what we do, and at least that is not, it's up to us. I mean, we create the causes and the conditions for what happens, but if you create the wrong causes and conditions, all kinds of things, it's like, it's really vast, the possibilities. And just your example about the person who could be an opera singer and then the whole, right? It just implies like, wow, we can change so much in one life. I just wanted to mention that. Like, think how much we can change over the course of 10 lifetimes or 2. Cynthia, you have something else?
So just related to that, thinking of kind of merely labeled. So how do I think of, the Buddha, right? So Buddha, so there's Buddhists, because I was looking at this the other day, contemplating on like preciousness of like having a teacher. So there's like 500 million some like Buddhists globally. So I was looking at kind of the statistics of just the religions and how it has grown over, like, so you can see that the Muslim population in terms of rate has increased, and it's almost much closer to Christianity than so many years ago. So you can see that that's all actually statistics in YouTube. I was looking at that, and you could see that as a percentage, the Buddhist population actually has, the rate of increase has decreased. So I was contemplating on that in relation to like the QAnon, for example, like just the rate in which they have increased the believers in the past 6 months has just accelerated because of, the theory they say is because we have the COVID situation. So, the search for information became kind of more, they became more susceptible to kind of the echo chambers created through the social media, through the internet.
Wait, so which one increased? Which group increased?
QAnon.
Oh, yeah.
You've heard for that, yeah. So I was looking at that, using that as my contemplation for the preciousness of. I hope not, but let's say you kind of, the Buddhist practitioners decreases over time, because Lama Zopa, for example, says it's the degenerate time.
Yep.
So, and also you could see that there's, at some point, there was kind of the Hinduism and Buddhism, there's some relationship to this religion, and also changes. So let's say at some point that kind of changes in form, like the label, because Buddhism, that's a mere label, right? The label Buddha exists in relation to the believer, us Buddhists that say there's a Buddha. But so I'm thinking, so I understand that. So, but if they're no longer believers, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's just that there's no object and subject. I don't know. So I'm trying to relate that to, we did say that the Buddha is a compounded phenomena. So it will be there regardless of whether there's, well, I don't know if that's the correct way to say it, but it exists whether or not there's believers, because then that will be inherently existent. So I'm trying to kind of like how to meditate on that, so the non-inherent existence of it, and can I relate that to the idea that the Buddha is uncompounded phenomena? Am I complicating?
No, I sort of get, well, tell me if this answers it, like, because one point is like, what they say, like, what they say, I'm going to give an example. Like, there's a famous story of Asanga, right? When he did like a 12-year retreat, like trying to see Maitreya. And then like after 12 years, he, you know, of meditating on Maitreya, he never saw Maitreya and he left, he gave up. And then he saw the dog, and the dog had wet maggots and was dying, and he had great compassion and love for the dog. And he tried to save the dog, you know, and like sacrificed himself in a way, cut himself to save the dog. And then suddenly the dog transformed and it was Maitreya. And he said, "Where were you for 12 years?" And Maitreya said, "I was there the whole time. You didn't have the merit to see me, you know." And he said, "But because of your love, I manifested as a dog to generate love from you. And then because of your love purified your karma. And then now you can see me as Maitreya, you know, like." And so part of that is like, the idea is that from one perspective, like Maitreya was there the whole time, like they would say the Buddhas exist, you know, in other words, you know, and but if beings on a certain culture or a certain planet or a certain place or a certain, you know, whatever, don't have the karma to interact with them, then they won't interact with them. Like a Sangha couldn't see Maitreya. And actually they say that, don't they? Like that, you know, and if you look at the teaching on the perfect human rebirth, which is what you're referring to, there's one point in there where they talk about the dark, one of the qualities is not being reborn in a dark age, right? And a dark age is what you're referring to. It's a time when there's no Buddhism on that planet. In terms of a cultural, like there's no, and what they actually would say though is like, that doesn't mean that a very unusual being was very, you know, like somebody like, there are these great Mahasiddhas or somebody who has strange karma, you know, they might be able to see still a Buddha because of their own individual karma, but the Buddha won't, but there's no Buddhism and there's no teachings and there's no, you know, and actually they say that will happen, you know, on this planet at some point. Like Shakyamuni Buddha's teachings will end and they won't be available. And until Maitreya comes, there'll be no Buddhist teachings around. And so, but the idea is that like, actually, like, it's actually interesting, isn't it? Like what they say is that the Buddha's mind is omniscient, so it pervades all phenomena. So in one sense, from the Buddha's own wisdom mind, it's everywhere. But whether we can interact with it depends upon our own karma and causes and conditions. And so in terms of the, like the, so I think that's it, that the Dharmakaya, they would say actually the Dharmakaya is everywhere, but sentient beings, yeah, we won't be able to interact with it unless we have the karma. So the idea really in that teaching is that it's actually, in a sense, like kind of similar, today's not really about reassuring at all. The idea is that it's actually, we're supposed to, in a sense, feel some sense of urgency, really, that, wow, like this is rare, you know, that's what the precious Rinpoche say, right? And that there, you know, Buddhism is in the degenerate time, it will continue to die out, eventually it'll disappear from this planet, you know, and then it'll come back at the time of Maitreya. But the idea is that, but the Buddhas in themselves, in other words, like, you know, there is like bodhisattvas, like on the bhumis, in the Pure Land, still see the Buddha, for example. You know, there's the Sambhogakaya form of the Buddha, that they say the Sambhogakaya doesn't disappear until until samsara is empty. There will always be Sambhogakaya Buddhas in Pure Lands teaching Mahayana. You know, but whether they can manifest in a meaningful way on a given planet with a given group of people depends on that group of people's karma. But does that answer your question, or is there more to it? I'm not sure.
No, it does help. I'm just trying to kind of like get some basis for the contemplation I'm doing. So
Yeah, but is the main one the precious human rebirth? Is that what you're really contemplating?
kind of the how precious, yeah, how precious the human rebirth. Yeah.
Yeah, and part of it, I guess I'll say like one other comment. Like, I think one way to think about it is that if we don't gain some realizations, you know, and things like that, then there really is a risk, right? That will end up in a situation where even if you have a karmic connection to Buddhism, there's no Buddhism, you know, and then like, I felt that, like, I often think back to when I was growing up, you know, like as a kid in America, there was almost no Buddhism here. Like, You know, it's like at that time, I mean, now it's much more. There was a little, you know, but I didn't come across it as a child, you know, and now there is Buddhism here, you know, but like if we don't have, so even if you have the karma, if the Buddhism is not there, then you won't, um, that karma won't manifest. You won't come across it. You won't, you know, and the idea though is like, so to make most of this, because what they say actually is if you gain the realizations though, then you'll be inseparable from, you know, like, whereas if you realize emptiness, if you realize bodhicitta, then there's no problem, you know, then you'll be inseparable from the Buddhas and Buddhist teaching. But if we don't gain those realizations, then we're in danger, even if we have some karmic connection, that it could be a very long time, you know, till we reconnect.
Yeah, thank you.
But I want to make oh, Alex, last question, and then we'll stop. I want to make a comment too. But...
Yeah, I had a question, Lauren, that I was thinking about during the last class. I think you were talking about the 5 paths and the path of seeing, and the study of the Prajna Paramita and the analytical meditation, which was, you know, the I guess the stage of the path of you were describing a realization of emptiness, and I was curious about, you know, it's getting way ahead, but other like another type of meditation, like say Mahamudra, would that be associated more with, say, the path of meditation, or sort of subsequent practice to these this type of meditation? And how would you, is there any sort of general way that you could, where would you present that kind of practice?
Mahamudra.
Yeah.
There's a famous couple of texts actually on Mahamudra by the first Panchen Lama, Losing Chökyi Gyaltsen, who was the teacher of the 5th Dalai Lama. He was great master. But and so he answers that question from his perspective, and as I'll follow him in my answer, you know, to that, which is, he says that the way he teaches Mahamudra is, he says he actually says that there's one kind of meditation on the conventional nature of mind, which is just clear and knowing, that he says actually is not real Mahamudra, but is kind of a skillful thing to do, which is more like a technique to give rise to calm abiding. So he says, he differentiates. He says, one is there are these kind of many techniques, and he shares some from different, that he praises very highly. And he says, there's this technique and that technique. He teaches a number of them that he says, these ones are to develop calm abiding. So you meditate on the clear knowing nature of mind. It's not yet realizing emptiness, but it's a very wonderful technique for giving rise to the mind of calm abiding in order to then realize emptiness. And it's a very good practice. So he says that's one type of practice, which is sometimes referred to as Mahamudra, but it's not the ultimate meaning of Mahamudra. Then he says, for somebody who's gained calm abiding on the conventional nature of mind like that, he uses this metaphor. He says they have this mind of calm abiding, and he says, then like a tiny fish moving under the surface of a pristine crystalline lake, one analyzes emptiness. So he says, within the context of this very expansive, clear, sort of peaceful, calm abiding on the nature of mind, you then do a kind of analysis, ultimate analysis, which is what we've been talking about here, and you realize, and then that person can realize emptiness. And then he says that realization of emptiness is the actual Mahamudra. When that person has calm abiding and then they realize the empty nature of mind, through that is a kind of ultimate analysis, but it's a very different experientially from the way we do it, because it's done by a person who's already realized calm abiding on the conventional nature of mind. And he says that's the actual Mahamudra. And then one thing he points out is that At that point, though, like there are different, so then, like so the real meaning of Mahamudra, Khenpo Rinpoche says, is the realization, is the mind realizing emptiness. He says that's the definitive meaning of Mahamudra. And the word even mudra can be translated seal. And he says it's the seal, Khenpo Rinpoche points this out, which is what Panchen Lama says. He says the seal of all phenomena, that which marks them, is emptiness. And he says, so the real meaning of Mahamudra is this realization of emptiness. And so that, initially that would happen on the level of the path of preparation, actually, in terms of the 5 paths you were asking about. But then the experience of the path of seeing, when the person directly realizes emptiness, that would be the actual first experience of the definitive meaning of Mahamudra. Would be when somebody realizes emptiness directly, that's the ultimate referent. When we say Mahamudra, so like, if you're just meditating on the clear conventional nature of mind, that's like we could say you're practicing Mahamudra, but you're not realizing Mahamudra. Then when you realize the path of preparation and you're meditating with calm abiding on emptiness, that's also a practice of Mahamudra, but that's not the realization of Mahamudra. So they say it's the realization of Mahamudra comes when you realize emptiness directly, which is on the path of seeing and meditation. So on those practices, which are very exalted, on the path of seeing and the path of meditation, those are like the definitive Mahamudra, in a sense that you're practicing the actual realization of emptiness and abiding in that uninterrupted state of realizing emptiness.
So it's better to understand it as a sense of like approximating or going gradually through stages or levels of beginning with the shamatha practice.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, and again, it's like, it's interesting, isn't it? Because all of those different things are sometimes referred to as practicing Mahamudra. But yeah, the Panchen Lama says, and you go through stages, and then the sort of definitive, the real meaning, the definitive meaning of Mahamudra is that direct realization of emptiness, which actually is the center, which really is the definitive meaning of Prajna Paramita. So you could say that the definitive Mahamudra, the definitive Prajna Paramita are the same experience.
Yeah.
It's just interesting.
Yeah, and so the first type of Mahamudra, which you described, is more like kind of a familiarization with your ordinary experience, your ordinary healthy mind and faculties of sense and all that stuff.
I know we have to stop, so I'll just say one quick comment, which is I was realizing that I hadn't put on the schedule anything else, and I wanted to say what I'm going to propose, if it's all right with people, is I'm going to send Gabe today or tomorrow, in the next day or two, I'll send them a schedule for November. And what I want to propose is that we're really very near the end of the text. So what I'm thinking to do, though, if it's all right with people, I was thinking it would be good. Lama Zopa should give some instruction also for meditation on the Heart Sutra, some actual practices to meditate. So what I want to propose is that we have 3 more classes. One where I'll just present the rest of the text. And then the last 2 classes, I'll do a little bit of presenting and mostly we'll meditate on, where you actually recite words from the sutra, then stop and meditate on them, and then recite a few more words and meditate on them. I just thought it'd be fun to do that. Are people interested in that? I guess is my question. Okay, so I'll schedule 3 more classes. 1 that'll be just presenting, and then 2 that'll be a little bit presenting, more meditation though. And then that'll be the end of, and then so 3 more, and then we'll sort of conclude this series, and we'll, we'll schedule another series, but a different topic. But I think that'll do it. 3 more. Okay, so yeah, 3 more classes in this series, and I'll send that schedule to Gabe by soon, very quickly, so that it can he posts it to the website and people can do your schedules accordingly or whatever. But and we should do the dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.